In the previous episode, our journey came to a pause in the Savinja Valley. We also saw that in the second half of the 6th century BC and throughout the 5th century BC, the hillforts of Styria entered a period of decline. Fewer people lived in these landscapes, and in several places archaeology even registers traces of communities whose material culture looks distinctly different from what came before. Yet just a short distance away, at the very same time, nothing seemed to echo that depopulation. Only a couple of forested mountain ridges stand between the Savinja Valley and another world altogether, a landscape with its own character, its own cultural rhythm, its own logic of historical change, and its own hillforts. So let's cross those ridges now and follow the story, now southward. We are now in a region known today as Zasavje. For centuries it has been associated with deposits and mines of various metal ores, and the roots of mining here, at least in its most rudimentary forms, likely reach back several millennia. Zasavje is a mountainous landscape carved by mostly narrow valleys. The slopes are often steep, and there are just very few broad terraces where crops can be grown, or large herds grazed for long. Yet people came here and stayed as early as the Neolithic. They were not drowned by easy farming, and certainly not by rich hunting grounds. By then, communities in Central Europe had already grasped the value of copper, and the search for new sources was most likely one of the reasons Zasavje began to be explored. Today, the best-known deposits of sulfide copper cluster mainly around Lycia and Radece, slightly beyond the core area we are about to follow. Yet the earliest finds currently known appear roughly midway between those 2 points, near modern Zagorje or Savi, if we treat the Sava's riverbed as our line of travel. Here archaeologists have recovered several flat and hammer-like stone axes, as well as a copper axe belonging to a type distributed in the late Neolithic from the Carpathians all the way to the Adriatic. We don't have direct proof that the first mines in these mountains already existed near Zagorje, but when these tools are compared with similar finds from Pohorje, where the evidence of Neolithic ore extraction is stronger, it becomes tempting to see Zagorje tools too as indirect traces of ore working, most probably copper already taking place somewhere in these hills. A different set of discoveries made in the 19th century not far from Zagorje, in an area known as Platz, several late Bronze Age axes types typical of the Eastern Alps, along with a sword and a sickle, suggest something else again, the remains of a metalworking workshop. Occasional traces of metallurgical slag reported from other parts of Zasavje only strengthen that impression. Copper and later iron was being worked here close to the sources of ore. This is especially true for sulfide copper. Hauling such ore over long distances makes little sense, because so much of its mass simply becomes waste. It's far more efficient to process it near the mine, which in turn helps to explain a more substantial settlement of the region towards the end of the Bronze Age and into the beginning of the Iron Age. Hillforts in this region begin to appear in the late Bronze Age and develop vigorously throughout the Iron Age. Shards of pottery, traces of man-made terraces, the remnants of ramparts and embankments, all of this lies hidden in these forested, sometimes sharply rising hills. So let's move through them now. We will visit the most striking locations, trying to imagine what these settlements looked like and who lived here at least 2,500 years ago. The surroundings of Zagorje or Savi offer at least 2 places worth our attention. The first is Konec nad Zagorjem, a settlement where metalworking was an important activity. It stood on a small plateau directly above steep broken slopes, at the point where the Media River flows into the Sava River. The man-made terraces on which the settlement once stood can be still traced on the ground today. Before 1882 there were more of them, but that year a catastrophic landslide struck, and the edge of the hill, along with a part of those protohistoric terraces, slid down into the valley. And it was here, in that vast heap of rock and soil left by that collapse, that the late Bronze Age tools were found in the 1890s. The landslide permanently destroyed the part of the settlement, but it also brought to the surface a deposit of objects. The axes, the sword and the sickle I mentioned earlier. In that light, the idea that unknown craftsmen may have produced at least some of these pieces right there on the hill no longer seems unlikely. Now let's move a little further north into the streets of modern Zagorje or Savi. Here our eyes are drawn to Otsepkov Hrib, a hill that seems to rise right out of the town itself. It caught the attention of archaeologists already in the end of 19th century. Why? Because in the 1890s, during house construction and sand extraction along what is today Cesta Borisa Kidricha, people began to uncover inhumation burials, skeletal graves, together with their grave goods. Similar discoveries followed in the first half and then again in the middle of the 20th century. Over time, the number of finds became substantial. Based on material itself and on how the graves clustered in space, archaeologists considered that this was once an entire necropolis lying directly below the southwestern slope of the hill. In terms of chronology, it belongs to the late Hallstatt centuries, roughly the 6th and 5th century BC, with some evidence extending into the 4th century BC. The grave goods, especially the belt fittings from the male burials, are striking for the level of craftsmanship they reveal. And one of the richest male graves uncovered as early as the 1890s contained something even more remarkable. Alongside the usual warrior's equipment there was a horse harness of a Scythian type, and beside it the remains of his own horse. It's hardly surprising that the first candidate for the associated settlement was Otsepkov Hrib itself. The slope begins immediately behind the line of houses. Admittedly, much of the hill today is made up of steep rocks, where no one could realistically have lived. But on the lower, gentler part, a smaller settlement could indeed have stood. And until the middle 20th century, the habitable area was larger than it is now. Over the decades it was gradually cut away by sand and gravel extraction. Today warehouses stand there, with residential buildings nearby, and any real chance of archaeological research there has sadly been lost. All that still hints that a Hallstatt period settlement on Otsepkov Hrib are the few small terraces on the southern slope, and scattered evidences from the years after the Second World War, when the now vanished parts of the hill were being quarried, and people occasionally turned up large amounts of ancient pottery, which at the time they scarcely thought worth nothing. Let's move on. From Zagorje and its narrow valley we now have to climb some 400 meters higher. Here there are only small villages, forests and hills that still hold the traces of people from other ages. The first hill fort on our route from Zagorje is Vrhek pri Vodicach, and a quick warning, don't confuse it with the hill fort called Vrhek that I mentioned in episode 1. Names like Vrh, the summit, and Vrhek, a little summit, are among the most common hill and mountain names in Slovenia. In any case, relatively little is known about this Vrhek. The hill fort stood on a rather inaccessible hill crowned by a very small plateau. In a few places you can still make out traces of ramparts, and researchers have found shards of both protohistoric and late antique pottery here. In the early Iron Age it was most likely a small hill fort, which together with its neighbor less than 2 kilometers away may have served as a lookout over a small enclosed valley, almost closed off to the east and west, where the village of Chelniще lies today. From here you can also see what is happening on the hill called Vrh on the opposite side, the very ridge that blocks our view of the deeper valley where Zagorje sits, with the Otsepkov Hrib rising above it. The neighboring hill fort is Gradišće Vrh nad Kalom. It lies at roughly the same elevation as Vrhek pri Vodicach, and it commands a clear view over the part of the Chelniще Valley that slopes down towards the Sava. In size it was somewhat larger than Vrhek. It was ringed by ramparts on almost all sides. Their remains are still visible today, except on the northern edge where the hill drops away into an impassable rock wall. And just as on Vrhek, researchers have found a protohistoric pottery here, going back at least to the late Bronze Age, as well as the late Antique sherds. Most likely both hillforts were used in roughly the same periods, and for much the same purpose. And if we fly about a kilometer west of Vrhnatkalam to the hilltop known as Spital pri Lambertu, we can make out a few small terraces and the faint remains of a rampart. Together with scarred fragments of protohistoric pottery, this allows us to say with some confidence, a small modest settlement existed here too, towards the end of the Bronze Age and into the beginning of the Iron Age. Now we continue westward, and this time we won't be looking at a single site, but at a small cluster of places relatively close to one another. To do that, we need to move about 3 kilometers to a broad plateau with the village of Tirna at its southern part. Just on the edge of the village, on the slight rise, you can make out what looks like ancient terraces and the remains of embankments. Yet the lack of proper archaeological investigation still makes it impossible to say with certainty whether these are terraces of an Iron Age settlement or the imprint of human activity from the later period. On the hills northwest of Tirna there are two places where one might suspect a protohistoric hillfort once stood. At the top of the hill called Vrhe, for example, there is a small flat area, and already in the 19th century its folk name was recorded as Aidovski Temple, which means Temple of Aidi. In Slovenia, ancient ruins and hillforts that local communities could no longer explain were often attributed to a mythical giants, the Aidi. So when you come across names such as Aidovshchina or Aidovski Temple, it usually means that someone at some point noticed traces of a very old settlement, ramparts, terraces, perhaps even the faint lines of foundations. But Chelshik, a hill that local tradition had long linked to something Aidi-like, and Vrhe, where in places you can still make out lines of stones brought there long ago. They are still waiting for the kind of attention that only professional archaeology can provide. From Tirna we now turn north and cross open ground over that broad plateau towards the outskirts of Rovishche. Here the traces of human presence become clear, at least as far back as the Iron Age. First of all, there is a pair of tumuli, which if you look carefully can still be picked out under the forest about half kilometer before you reach the village. High above Rovishche, on the wooded hills Mali Vrh and Gorny Vrh, Hallstatt period inhumation burials have been found. And then, a little further west, a hill called Gradišće appears, a name that almost unknown since what we should expect there, a hillfort. The slopes are steep, but the hill is accessible from the road that leads from Rovishche to Sveta Gora. And yes, here we can still see a few small terraces where long ago houses may have stood. Unfortunately, the site has not, at least so far, produced any particularly striking finds. It's time to climb higher. Directly above Gradišće rises Sveta Gora, the Holy Mountain. The name is entirely logical, its summit crowded by a fortified church. A church has stood here since at least 1250, though the building we see today was substantially rebuilt in the Baroque style in 1704. The defensive walls around it are a reminder of the hard and dangerous times, when in the 15th and 16th centuries people from nearby villages sought refuge behind this fortification during Ottoman raids. But our interest lies farther back in time. And when you look at this hill with its church and few buildings clustered beside it, it's hard to shake the feeling that it would make a perfect protohistoric hill fort. That feeling doesn't deceive you. Such a fort must once have existed here, as Sveta Gora dominates the plateau of Rovishche and Tirna, as well as the three other hill forts I have just mentioned. From here you can also see the long valley to the north of the ridge, of which Sveta Gora is one of the highest peaks. Why do I phrase it so cautiously must have existed? Because modern construction and a small cemetery on the summit make excavation extremely difficult today. What we know and what researchers cautiously suppose rests either on isolated protohistoric finds made as early as the 19th century, or on more recent observations that along the slopes of the hill one can still pick up sherds of pottery dating back to the late Bronze Age. All the hillforts we have just passed, from Konec nad Zagorjem to Zasavska Sveta Gora, can be grouped into a single coherent cluster. They are relatively small, simply because the hills on which they stand offer little room for large settlements. Most of them, if we leave Zagorje itself aside for a moment, are within direct line of sight of one another, 1 or 2 kilometers apart, often occupying neighboring ridges. It's hard not to see them as a part of a single network. And we can probably add at least 2 more sites to it. Strachovlje on the hill above town of Kisovets, sadly now being gradually eaten away by a quarry, and Shemnik not far from here, where the remains of ramparts are still visible. The beginnings of this hypothetical network likely reach back to the end of the Bronze Age. The earlier sites it seems appeared above what is now Zagorje and on Zasavska Sveta Gora, Holy Mountain. By 8th centuries BC, settlements on the hills above the Sava must already have been developing. The pattern of space in small hillforts placed in visual contact mirrors what we see farther south in Dolenjska, where such hillfort landscapes crystallize quickly in the same 8th century BC. Many of these sites left behind a particularly eloquent kind of evidence, whole heaps of what Slovenians call žlindra, slag from iron production. It's the waste left after smelting iron from easily obtainable limonite, the brown iron stones that can be gathered or mined with relatively simple means. Some 19th century reports even claim that in karstic hollows in the forests near certain hillforts the slag lays in such quantities that it could have been carted away by the wagon load. These traces of small-scale local metallurgy suggest that some of these hillforts may have been above all workshop settlements, places where iron tools were produced, and where the people who made them also needed to protect themselves. The hillfort that rose within what is now the town of Zagorje, however, seems to be younger. People appear to have found reason to settle there only in the 6th century BC, and the most active phase of its existence continued at least into the 4th century BC. That is the conclusion suggested by the numerous objects recovered from the burrows beneath the hill, beginning already in the second half of the 19th century. And there is one more striking feature that links many of the hillforts we have discussed, a feature no less important than the clear signs of metalworking. It is the burial rite. In this region, inhumation began to dominate over cremation starting from the 6th century BC. Of course, this shift has not happened in Zasavje alone. In episode 1 we already saw this new fashion emerging, for example, in the second half of the 6th century BC beneath Rifnik. Similar burials are known south of the Sava as well, within the heartland of the Dolenjska Hallstatt group. There are also examples north to the Savinja Valley, as far away as the area of modern Slovene Gradec. Exactly how this new rite spread and why Zasavje contains such a dense concentration of inhumation burials associated with the late Hallstatt period, the 6th and the 5th centuries BC, remains a matter of scholarly debate. One hypothesis links it to the infiltration of Scythian-like groups from the Pannonian steppe, who could have reached even Zasavje via the Savinja Valley and then along the Media corridor. From here, communities that adopted the rite may have carried it further, even into the northern edge of Dolenjska, south of the Sava. However, in most other cultural features, the people of Zasavje were still apparent closest to the Dolenjska world. So, in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, within this seemingly harsh micro-region, two large cultural currents may have met and, to some extent, merged. And perhaps the demand for ore and for objects of copper and iron was what for a time made such different people willing to live and work side by side. If we look west from the summit of Zasavska Sveta Gora, we can see at once that we are standing on the peak of a long ridge stretching far in the distance, seemingly all the way towards the Ljubljana basin. This is one of the westernmost ridges of the Posavsko hribovje, the Sava Hills as it's known in English, and it feels that this ridge invites hillforts. From here you could keep an eye on the hills above the Sava to the south, and on the long lowland to the north, a natural corridor that in fact leads towards the same Ljubljana basin. So our flight west from Sveta Gora, just 3 kilometers or so, brings us to a place that is curious and even symbolic for Slovenia as a whole. The country's official geographical center lies not far from here, but that is not our destination, not yet. What we are looking for are these broad clearings among the forested hills. They mark the heart of the Vače complex, the hill fort itself, the famous and the extraordinary rich cemeteries nearby, and the surrounding slopes and lowlands where people carried out their everyday work. Vače is not just a settlement on a hill. It's really an entire complex, a place where economic interests and quite possibly political interests too converged within this small region. And it's here, within the network of hill forts we are tracing in this episode, we can find the richest burials of all. Vače looks very much like a true center of regional power, a gathering point for local elites, including warrior elites. And it's impossible not to mention two discoveries that turned the name Vače into a symbol. In 1882, archaeologists found the famous Vače situla, now displayed in the National Museum of Slovenia in Ljubljana. And in 1883 they uncovered the no less famous belt plate with the battle scene, an object that since the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire has been housed in the Natural History Museum in Vienna. Of course, these are celebrated finds, but they are far from the only ones. For a century and a half, researchers have been dealing with genuine treasures from this landscape, treasures as you understand in the archaeological sense. Finds made in different years, on the hill fort itself and across several burial areas, with two main cemeteries standing out clearly, open up an astonishing picture of how this community evolved over centuries of the Iron Age. So what do we know? Despite a few earlier burials that can be associated with the late Urnfield Wold, it's better to speak yet of a thin pre-Hallstatt layer rather than of a fully formed center. The Vače complex, with the settlement here on the hill known as Krona, with so-called Špičasti hrib at the top and with its branching system of cemeteries, unfolds from the 8th century BC onward. It's then that the outline of the classic hill fort begins to emerge. On the following centuries, the settlement expanded across the upper part of Krona, following its natural contours. Stone fortifications appear and buildings with stone foundations, and on the distinctive spur that ends at the hill of Slemšek, a cult place most likely took shape, a setting for ritual events and offerings. From the very beginning, Vače seems to have formed as a center for processing iron and copper ores, and for producing the metal goods that society needed, from ornaments to tools and weapons. Several facts point in that direction. The surrounding landscape offers only limited areas suitable for agriculture. The burials around the hill fort are rich in fibulae, rings, bracelets, knives, axes, weapons, helmets, and many of these objects appear to be local products. And there are also traces of copper and iron slag, the same kind of evidence we encountered near Tirna. Vače, in other words, looks like the continuation and the culmination of the settlement network we have already followed from the hills around Zagorje to Sveta Gora, a chain bound together by a shared economic interest, rooted in ore extraction and metalworking. In the earliest stage of the hill fort's development, which we can roughly place to the 8th century BC, social stratification is not yet sharply visible. We can distinguish only two main groups, warriors and craftsmen. The warriors naturally from the core of the elite, those who laid the foundations for what would later become an economically powerful community. Archaeologists recognize their burials, among other things, by the presence of a bowl-shaped helmet. In this same period, a division between two population groups also begins to emerge. Who exactly these groups were, different clans, different origins, different beliefs, different social standings, we cannot say with certainty. But archaeology suggests that they buried their dead in two separate cemetery zones. And in this early phase, the eastern cemetery, River, becomes the resting place of that first formative elite. In the first half of the 7th century BC, change is already in the air. The social structure of the Vače community becomes markedly more complex. Even within the warrior stratum, we can now recognize at least three distinct ranks. The artisan class remains clearly visible. And among women the picture becomes even more finely graded. Archaeologists can distinguish as many as 7 different types of dress, revealing a strong internal hierarchy shaped by both status and age. The very top grows noticeably wealthier. At this stage we can speak of truly princely burials, now concentrated on the western cemetery zone known as Ravne Nive. The warrior elite buried there adopts elements of an equestrian culture and sometimes does not part from its horse even in death. It's worth stressing that geographically Vače and its surroundings lie slightly outside the historical core of Dolenjska, Lower Carniola. But in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, economically, culturally, militarily, and in the way society is structured, Vače looks like a very typical community of the Dolenjska Hallstatt group, simply positioned on its northern edge. A new wave of change arrives in the middle of the 6th century BC. Everything that enters the ground within the Vače complex from this point and for roughly the next 100 years, Slovenian researchers such as Stane Gabrovec and Biba Tržan refer to as the Scythian horizon. Why Scythian? Recall that we saw in Styria, the decline of hillforts, the appearance of people whose material culture points eastward, to the steppe world. All of this unfolds in that same middle 6th century, and the echo of those wider movements could reach even here, traveling along the nature corridors, through the Savinja Valley, and then along the narrow route of the Media, which flows into the Sava through Zasavje, right into the hills controlled by the Vače community. Unlike Styria and even unlike the Savinja Valley with Rifnik nearby and home rising directly above it, Zasavje does not seem to experience anything comparable to collapse or depopulation at this time. On the contrary, it receives an additional impulse of development. Cultural shifts are felt across the region, including at Vače itself. Inhumation burials become more frequent. They existed earlier, but now this practice takes on the character of a new fashion. We also begin to see markers associated with the Scythian there, 3-bladed arrowheads and steppe-style horse harness. Elite burials from this period seems to sway between older tradition and new influences. And a perfectly reasonable question follows: what actually happened to the powerful leaders of Vače? Did they for a time have to accept some kind of subordinate status after aggressive raids by Scythian-like newcomers from the Pannonian steppe? Or did the local elite simply adopt a new culture tradition, leading to a largely peaceful integration of traditions and perhaps even of different ethnic groups, bound together by shared economic interests in a region rich in ores? We don't know. We can only observe a few puzzling tendencies. For example, in burials that include weapons and Scythian-type horse equipment, fibulae are entirely absent. We can only hope that sooner or later there will be researchers with sufficient resources and the most modern analytical tools to push this question further. By the middle of the 5th century BC, the Vače complex undergoes another transformation. The steppe influence fades. In its place comes a clear reorientation toward close interaction with northern Italy, above all with the Etruscan and Venetic world. The economy evidently rises again, and at the same time the princely elite stabilizes after several decades of Scythian turbulence. Chiefs return with the familiar symbols of authority, now joined by helmets of the Negava or Negao type. And once again these leaders appear to emerge from the same two main population groups, associated with two principal cemetery zones. Yet the leadership itself seems not to remain with either group for long. It alternates, shifting between those who bury their dead in the western necropolis and those who do so in the eastern one. It's in this time, perhaps even in the first half of the 5th century BC, that the settlement of Vače receives the object that has become its archaeological calling card, the famous Vače situla, admired to this day. It was made for a local ruler, and highly likely we could recognize him among the figures embossed on its surface. But the craftsmen who produced this unquestionable masterpiece of situla art either traveled here from the lands of the Veneti or was at least trained at their workshops. The influence of the Este artistic tradition carried by the North Adriatic Veneti is simply too strong to ignore. The situla was found among the burials of the Eastern Cemetery, River. There too another famous object came from the ground, the belt plate with the dual scene, 2 mounted opponents, 2 seconds in feathered helmets, and a 5th figure, an arbiter, who for some reason seems already to have lost interest in the contest and is walking away. This belt plate belongs to the same archaeological horizon as the situla, the so-called Negava horizon, though it entered the ground slightly later, most likely towards the end of the 5th century BC. In other words, at roughly the same time as the Peloponnesian War was burning far to the south of the Balkan Peninsula. Together, the belt plate and the situla are among the most vivid testimonies to life on the northern edge of the Dolenjska Hallstatt world. Thanks to them and to a small figurine of a spear bearer found nearby, we can begin to picture how the people of Vače looked in the 5th century BC, how they dressed, what they valued, how they fought, and how they imagined themselves. Of course, life in Vače did not end with that century, it continued into the La 10 period. The first hints of change appear already in the 5th century BC. In some finds we begin to see ornaments that look more Celtic, and influences arriving from the lands of today's Bavaria and Lower Austria, and even further north from the banks of the Elbe and the Oder rivers. But the Celticization of the Eastern Alpine region and the spread of the Latin culture across these lands deserves a story on its own. For now it's time to leave Vače behind and continue west along the chain of hills. There is still more to see ahead. We are now gliding over the monument that marks the geographical center of Slovenia. And almost immediately beyond it, the hill of Zgornja Slivna comes into view. There are indications that a kind of satellite hillfort of Vače may have once have stood here. The distance from the heart of the Vače complex is just over 3 kilometers as the bird flies. Unfortunately, no published archaeological research is readily available for this spot. It's entirely possible that no one has ever excavated here at all. A little further west, however, we find something more substantial. Ahead of us rises the hill fort above the village of Dešan, with a name as plain as many others across Slovenia, Gradišće. Today it's a typical wooded hill of this region, its southern slope is steep, and from it the Savinja Valley opens up below. People settled here very early. A series of archaeological finds, mostly pottery sherds, allows us to speak with confidence about occupation already in the Neolithic. Then it seems the hill lay quiet for a long time, and suddenly it became useful again in the late Hallstatt period from around 600 BC onward. That is when defensive works were built on the northern side, not merely earthen ramparts but a stone wall. Behind it people lived, and workshops evidently functioned here as well. Modern archaeologists have identified iron slugs suggesting metallurgical activity. Most likely it was one of those outlying production centers linked to the major hub at Vače, the kind of place scholars had long suspected must have existed. And intriguingly, the same Iron Age wall was probably reused much later too. In the early Middle Ages, this hill once again served as a refuge, a small fortress where people could hide over the periods of danger. And very close to this hill fort, barely a kilometer away in a straight line, we can make out the faint traces of another fortified place on the hill of Gorišća. Here, unfortunately, the story has a bitter twist. A television relay tower now stands in the center of the hill, and when it was built in the 1980s, part of the archaeological record was simply destroyed. Even so, the construction did not erase everything. Archaeologists were still able to identify Hallstatt period pottery and traces of house daub. Today, LiDAR imagery strengthens the picture further. The lines of the ramparts show up clearly on the terrain model. And if you climb Gorišća yourself close to the tower, you can still see those earthworks in a few places with your own eyes. So let's take one last look at the steep rocky slopes of Gorišća and continue west along the same chain of hills. You may already have noticed a pattern. The slopes that fall into the Moravče Valley tend to be gentler, while those facing south with views towards the Sava are steeper. It seems likely that communication across this hillfort chain, at least from Zgornja Slivna to Gorišća, run along ridgetop paths where one hill naturally leads into the next. If we follow that imagined route 4 kilometers farther west, above the village of Križevska Vas, a true surprise awaits us. The remains of a hill fort whose earthworks are far more clearly visible than those of the three sides between it and Vače. This is Gradišće Pelinovec, which for some reason is also recorded under two alternative names, Gradišće nad Križevska Vasio and Ainškovo Gradišće. Despite its striking visibility of its ramparts and internal terraces, this hill fort has still not been thoroughly investigated by archaeologists. No necropolis have been identified nearby, and it's not even clear whether there was one cemetery or several. For now, we can only suspect that Pilinoves may have been one of the westernmost point of the regular communication zone linked back to Vače via Zgornja Slivna, along the ridge tops. And today, walking the hiking trail that roughly follows this line, you can enjoy a quiet, almost theatrical moment. The ancient rampart suddenly rises before you, once far higher than it is now, and you step into the space of a former settlement. Only silence remains, the sound of winds and birds, and faint echoes of modern life somewhere beyond the trees. Yet it's hard not to imagine how it must have felt here in the past 2,500 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. Human voices, the calls of animals, and above all that unmistakable ringing metallic sound drifting from the smithies. Perhaps this was one of the northwestern outposts of the Hallstatt communities we now call the Dolenjska group, a place that looked both north into the River Valley and south towards the endless ridges beyond the Sava, many of which were densely settled in the early Iron Age. And in the next episode we will travel there, to the core centers of the Dolenjska Hallstatt world. But for now, let's pay tribute to the people who in different times and in different ways opened this world to us, the hillforts of Zasavje and the settlements on the lone ridge of hills stretching west from Sveta Gora. Now I want to name the people we truly owe thanks to. They were very different from one another, and they lived in different centuries. Yet each in their own way helped build the knowledge we have today about the Iron Age settlements of Zasavje, including the westernmost hills of the Posavsko hribovje. So let us remember them one by one. Franz Peruzzi, a village school teacher, thanks to whom the story of Vače ceased to be a string of accidental finds in a field and entered the world of scholarship. In 1877 he recorded one of the earliest discoveries near the village of Klenik and passed both the information and the objects via local authorities to the Carniolan Provincial Museum in Ljubljana. In doing so, he became the first vital bridge that set in motion the systematic research and excavation around Vače. Dragutin Karol Dežman, the curator or director of the Carniolan Provincial Museum in Ljubljana, the man who transformed Vače from a place of few curious accidental finds into a major event in the archaeology of his time. After the first reports from Klenik area, he took the initiative, organized trial digs and the first systematic excavations, gathered people and resources, documented the results, and opened the way for Vače to enter the scientific conversation of Europe. Without his energy and discipline, much of this story might have vanished into private collections or remained in the ground. And this road did not stop at one lucky place in 1878. Dežman initiated the first reconnaissance of protohistoric cemeteries and hillforts in the wider Zasavje landscape, around Zagorje Savi, Zasavska Sveta Gora, Roviще and Tirna. He did not do this work alone, but together with the next figure in our list. Ferdinand von Hochstetter, an honored Viennese geologist and scholar who helped to move the finds of Zasavje and Vače above all from the realm of sensations into comparative analysis and careful systematization. Thanks to this attention to detail to weapon types, helmets, equipment and the wider parallels, finds from Vače, Zasavska Sveta, Gora and other places in Zasavje began to be read as a part of the broader Hallstatt world, rather than as isolated local curiosities. He gave these objects the language of science and enabled later generations to date and interpret the whole landscape with far greater precision. Janez Grlic, a resident of Klenik, the village lying directly beneath Krona, the ridge where the Vače hill fort once stood. In the early 1880s, watching archaeologists recover ancient artifacts nearby, he began his own excavations, not as a scholar but as a curious local who happened to become a part of a major discovery. In 1882, in the cemetery of River, he lifted from the earth Slovenia's most famous situla, the one we know today as the Vače situla. Prince Ernst zu Windisch-Grätz, an aristocrat and organizer of excavations who became one of the key figures of the field phase of research at Vače in the 1880s. A number of major finds are connected with his work, above all the famous belt plate with a scene of mounted duel, recovered in 1883 from an inhumation grave. His role was typical of that era, positioned between scholarship and private initiative, between the passion for antiquities and the need to preserve and record them. And whatever we may think today of archaeology under the patronage of a wealthy sponsor, his activities left behind material without which our picture of Iron Age elites in Zasavje would be far poorer. Jernij Pečnik, a professional field digger, a practical archaeologist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who worked for both the Carniolan Provincial Museum in Ljubljana and the Natural History Museum in Vienna. In 1880s he walked vast stretches of what is now central Slovenia on foot, including Zasavje, speaking with local residents about old graves and carefully recording traces of hillforts and tumuli on his archaeological maps. He took part in numerous excavations, including around Zagorje and at Vače, yet his greatest contribution was not a single spectacular object, but the patient systematization and mapping of the region's archaeological landscape, the very landscape we have been traveling through. Moritz Horns, an Austrian protohistorian and museum scholar in Vienna, who attempted one of the most gentle tasks for Vače and for Zasavje more broadly, turning the apparent chaos of early finds into a coherent chronological framework. He was among the first to organize the Vače material systematically by burial rite, older cremations, younger exhumations, and to think in terms of the lifespan of a cemetery. Even where later research refined or corrected his scheme, it remained a crucial scaffold, a starting point from which the Hallstatt world of Zasavje could be argued, tested, and rebuilt. Alfons Müllner, an archaeologist and curator of the Carniolan Provincial Museum in Ljubljana, who took over the museum after Dežman's death. He was the first in 1889 to describe a Neolithic and Bronze Age tools from Platz near Zagorje Savi, the very area where a landslide had once destroyed part of the hill. He also documented early investigations of the inhumation burials at Raven, another site later erased by industrial development beneath the hill where we traced the settlement of Konec. And he did not overlook the first discoveries beneath Otsepkov Hrib in Zagorje. In general, Müllner helped turn scattered finds into a regional story, not just a single site. Walter Schmidt, a field archaeologist who in the 1930s did what was desperately needed after the great cemetery era of Vače. He turned attention from famous objects back to settlement itself. His work on Spodnja and Zgornja Krona provided the first clear evidence for the structure of the hill fort, buildings with stone foundations and traces of a defensive wall, as well as new material from the cemeteries. Thanks to Schmidt, Vače ceased to be only a story of rich graves and became what it truly was, a living center that can be reconstructed as a settlement, and from here used to read Zasavje as a wider network of related fortified places and landscapes. France Stare, an archaeologist and scientist who did what is most difficult and least noticeable purely visually. He assembled Vače into a coherent system. In his work of 1954, he did not merely describe individual finds, he tried to reconstruct the chronology and inner logic of the complex, from different burial types to the development of the settlement and its crafts. He was honest about contradictions in the sources, about gaps in documentation, and about what could and could not be demonstrated through typology and comparison. His study became a solid foundation for later generations of scholarship, and without it, creating this episode would have been much harder. Stane Gabrovic, a Slovenian archaeologist and the one of the scholars who gave our topic a clear chronological backbone. Thanks to his periodization and to the concept of archaeological horizons in the traditions that later authors still built upon, the material from Vače and the neighboring hillforts of Zasavje stops being a set of raw dates by feel and becomes a readable The material from Vače and the neighboring hillforts of Zasavje stop being a set of raw dates by feel and becomes a readable sequence of change in burial rites, weaponry, ornaments, and external influences. Gabrovic did what the best synthesis always do. He taught us to see behind a scattered collection of finds a more coherent story of how Vače and similar Iron Age communities evolved. Janez Dular, an archaeologist and synthesizer who helped us to see Vače and the hillforts of Zasavje as a landscape system. His work in topography and settlement analysis provides what you need if you want to tell a hillfort story honestly. Where a settlement actually stood, how it was laid out, where the cemeteries lay, and how far its influence reached. Through this lens, Vače becomes a comprehensive center within a network of fortified places above the Sava. Biba Terzhan, an archaeologist who brought Vače back from the realm of a legend built on a few museum masterpieces into a complete scientifically assembled world. Her strength lies in holding two scales at once, the tiniest detail, a fibula, a spur, a fragment of slag, and the large model built from it, how elites changed, how rituals shifted, how fashions moved, how connections with the Adriatic and with the Eastern sphere appeared and faded, and how all of this can be tied to specific horizons. And in her recent work Vače II, she achieved something that once seemed almost impossible. She systematically brought into scholarship a vast body of archaeological material that had been kept in various museums for decades, giving us a new, sharper picture of Hallstatt Zasavje. And she also played an important role as a scholarly mentor to one more figure, a representative of the next generation of researchers. This is Matej Draxler. Matej is an archaeologist who redirected attention to the small geography of Zasavje, to hillforts forgotten and sometimes erased by later development, to burials beneath today's town streets as in Zagorje of Savi, to archaeological layers, and to both famous and less famous finds anchored carefully in their surrounding landscape. In his work, he patiently gathers and checks data from specific sites, cemeteries and hills, weaving what seems fragmentary into a single living picture. Where people lived in the hills north of the Sava in the Bronze and Iron Ages, where they searched for ores and how they smelted copper and iron, how burial practices changed, and what all of that tells us about proto-historic local communities. With Draxler, the archaeology of Zasavje comes alive in the most literal sense. After reading his work, it feels as every slope, every cliff, every small terrace on a hillside begins to whisper its own story, a story that reaches thousands of years into the past. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave a comment. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I'd be glad if you did. It really helps and I promise it's worth it. And if you'd like to support my work and help me to create the next parts of the hills a little faster, you can do so through Buy Me a Coffee. You will find the details in the first pinned comment under this video. See you soon!